Fingers crossed.
Yes. Un placard vert, il sonne horriblement. Parfois, je suis électrocuté un peu, mais non, j'espère que on n'a pas besoin. Ho fatto un buon viaggio?
Sì, sono arrivato ieri.
Ah. Questo è cospetto, c'è tutto. Avete l'acqua. Parli en anglais?
Oui, yes, yes. Irlanda, yes.
Yes?
Irlanda. I'm Irish.
Yes, yeah,
Yes,
I know,
yes,
I know.
yeah.
Così come si legge? MacCARRON.
Yes, Maureen.
More. Prego?
La campanella.
Sì. Io non sono mai stato un perfetto, non so perché, però insomma ce la faremo.
Né un certo.
C'è il microfono, bellezza. Perfetto. Ecco, signore e signori.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Yesterday we had the full immersion bead morning, and today we are going on with immersion. Because we have with us Professor Maureen MacCarRON. She'll speak about title is Historical Chronology in the Early Middle Ages, the Venerable Beads, Innovation and Influence. I apologize for my ugly English, but so. Prego.
Thank you. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to be here. And thank you to the interpreters who are doing extraordinary work behind us on the stage. The Venerable Bede lived from circa 673 to 735 in the Kingdom of Northumbria in the northeast of Britain, and spent most of his life in the monastery of Wearmouth and Jarrow, which he had entered at the age of 7. He was a prolific author and wrote scriptural commentaries, homilies, computistical textbooks, grammatical treatises, hagiographies, histories, letters, and more. Bede wrote 2 works on time reckoning, both of which we heard about yesterday in the afternoon session. The earliest is known as De Temporibus and was completed in 703, and the second is known as De Temporum Ratione and was completed in 725. De Temporum Ratione greatly expands on the contents of De Temporibus and also includes cosmography, which Bede had earlier dedicated a separate work to, De Natura Rerum, which we also heard about yesterday, also written around 703, probably as a companion work for De Temporibus. Bede's other intervention in the history of time was his decision to use AD dating as the major chronological framework in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. In doing so, Bede made AD dating a historical chronology, which had far-reaching effects. However, before turning to Bede and AD dating, which took place towards the end of his life, I will start by examining his contributions to historical chronology at the beginning of his career, specifically his use of a shorter Anno Mundi in his World Chronicles. Bede included his 2 World Chronicles in his works on time. Both De Temporibus and De Temporum Ratione explain time according to 7 divisions of time: the moment, the hour, the day, month, year, generation, and age, aetas. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they are concerned with the calculation of Easter, which was a major concern of Bede's throughout his life. Indeed, De Temporibus was written while the Easter controversy remained a live issue in Britain and Ireland. And we will return to the link between chronology and computus a little later. Bede's chronicles replace abstract discussions of the longer divisions of time, which are found in other such computistical works. In De Temporibus, the chronicle directly covers the divisions of generations and age. In both chronicles, Bede recounted world history from Adam to his time of writing and measured time by counting the years from creation, the Anno Mundi. However, the Anno Mundi used by Bede caused consternation in his own day and has garnered attention ever since. There were 3 different Anno Mundi reckonings in the early medieval world. The earliest was a usage which placed creation 5,500 years before the Nativity. However, the more enduring placed creation about 5,200 years before the Nativity. Specifically, users of that chronology tended to date the Passion and Crucifixion to 5,228 years after creation. This chronology was based on the Septuagint version of scriptures, the Greek scriptures that were circulating in the medieval world at the time. Bede, in contrast, used the Vulgate scriptures for his chronology. That's the Latin translation begun by Jerome in the late 4th century. And Bede dated the Nativity to Anno Mundi 3952. Consequently, he had shortened the age of the world by 1,247 years. The general view in much scholarship is that Bede opted for a shorter chronology in order to present the present day further away from Anno Mundi 6000, a date that was often thought to mark the end of the world. We heard a little about that in Immo's paper yesterday. This view has been underlined by the negative reaction to Bede's Anno Mundi chronology from his contemporaries, including an accusation of heresy in the presence of Bede's diocesan bishop, Wilfrid. This charge appears to have come from an assumption that each age of the world, there are 6 ages of the world, and each age should be roughly 1,000 years. Because Bede placed the incarnation in Anno Mundi 3952, he was accused of thinking that the incarnation took place in the 4th age of the world rather than the 6th. This is nonsense, of course, because Bede explicitly started the 6th age with the Nativity. However, this accusation of heresy became something of a preoccupation for Bede. He took it very, very badly. On learning of the charge, he aggressively defended himself by denouncing those who believed that the end of the world can be calculated at all. He did this in his letter to Plegwin, dated to AD 708, which he asked to be read aloud at Wilfrid's court. So the same place where he was accused of heresy, he wanted his defense to be proclaimed. Bede attacked such views again at the beginning of De Temporum Ratione, almost 20 years later, and he added 5 chapters on eschatology after the World Chronicle in that work to further underline that we are not supposed to know the day nor the hour. because anti-apocalypticism is such a theme in Bede's later works, it is believed to be the inspiration for his Vulgate chronology in 703. However, in my view, this is reading the evidence backwards, as Bede seems little concerned with apocalypticism in the First Chronicle. He was not oblivious, of course, to apocalyptic thinking in 703. He would have encountered such ideas in his sources, not least in a dating clause found in his Computus exemplar that provides us with a date of AD 658, but the actual date says that there are 141 years left until the end of the world. However, Bede appears to have been shocked to encounter such thinking so close to home in response to his De Temporibus. Consequently, it seems to me that apocalyptic concerns were a secondary consideration when he wrote the Chronicle. One indication, I think, of the lack of prominence of apocalyptic ideas is the scarcity of Anno Mundi dates in the First Chronicle. The only event dated from creation is the Nativity, and that's done using both Vulgate and Septuagint chronologies. It's 3952 and 5199 from creation. The chronological framework of the First Chronicle is generations and ages rather than years, as Bede structured the work on the 6 ages of the world and the number of generations in each age. And we can just see this in this 9th century manuscript from St. Gall of De Temporibus, where you can see each of the entries. It's not numbers, it's just each generation. So the first letter of each entry is, if you can see it, begins each line. So it's very much generations, and then the 6th age begins here. In contrast, in his second chronicle, Bede assertively, almost aggressively, uses Anno Mundi years throughout. And we can see this the De Temporum Ratione is in the same manuscript from St. Gall, and you can see the Anno Mundi years are marked very clearly in red on this slide. In addition, much of the discourse around Bede's choice of chronology in De Temporibus within modern scholarship, I think, overstates the homogeneity of the world chronicle tradition. There's an assumption that late antique and early medieval world chronicles consistently used a universal and linear chronology, but they didn't. Chroniclers from Eusebius in the 3rd century to Isidore of Seville in the 7th century used a variety of chronological systems to underpin their work. Eusebius, in his chronicle, later translated from the Greek into Latin by Jerome, used years from Abraham. This was also used by Prosper of Aquitaine, who added Annus Passionis reckoning. Hydacius used Olympiads with Roman imperial years. Cassiodorus used consular years. Marcellinus Comes used the indiction cycle and consular years. So you can see there's a variety. Isidore of Seville, I think, was unusual in explicitly using Anno Mundi years as the overarching chronological system in his work, and that's in the 7th century. However, despite the selection of chronological reckonings employed, when chroniclers prior to Bede engage with the age of the world, they do follow the Septuagint, even if they're not using Anno Mundi chronology otherwise. So Bede's chronology does diverge, but not as much as is often argued. I believe that Bede turned to the Vulgate for chronology because he followed Jerome in thinking that the Vulgate version of the scriptures were more accurate. Jerome began his major translation program in about 390, having at that point, by all accounts, lost faith in the tradition of the Septuagint. This was after he had spent years in scriptural study on variant biblical traditions in an effort to improve Latin translations of the Septuagint. He seems to have been particularly concerned that certain passages in the New Testament referred to Old Testament texts not preserved in the Septuagint. He addressed this in the preface to Questiones Hebraecae in Genesum, written circa 392, in where he outlined the divergences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Scriptures. Jerome noted that the evangelists and Paul quote many things as if from the Old Testament, which are not contained in our books. Jerome returned to this idea at greater length in defending his translation project in the Pentateuch preface, where he offered several examples in support of his argument. One of the most famous of these is in John's account of the crucifixion, when the piercing of Jesus' side with a lance is presented as in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And the text is, "And again another scripture saith, they shall look on him whom they pierced." The reference is to Zechariah 12:10, but the verse isn't included in the Septuagint. In restoring these verses to the canon of Scripture, as Jerome saw it, he argued that he was helping Christians to see Christ in the Old Testament. We know that Jerome's Vulgate translation of the Bible was given special status at Wearmouth and Jarrow, as the famous Codex Amiatinus, which left Northumbria for Rome with Abbot Ceolfrith, Bede's abbot, in 716, is a full Vulgate Bible. Amiatinus was one of 3 such Bibles completed at the time in Wearmouth Jarrow. The other 2 were to remain in the monasteries, where they could be consulted by members of the community. Single-volume biblical pandects were extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily expensive to complete in this period, and Amiatinus is the earliest complete Vulgate Bible that we currently know of. Along with adopting Jerome's text of the Bible, the Wearmouth Jarrow monks also reproduced several of Jerome's accompanying gospel prefaces in Amiatinus, indicating their importance and eloquently testifying to the esteem within which Jerome was held in that community. The contemporary evidence from Bede's monastery provides ample context for his decision to turn to the Vulgate for chronology. We don't know how many years the community at Wearmouth Jarrow spent on Ceolfrith's biblical project, or how long before 716 they had completed all 3 Bibles. But I think we can assume that an endeavour of this scale preoccupied several members of the community over many years, and can infer that the monastery possessed a full Vulgate text of the Old Testament prior to beginning their copying programme. The attention given to Jerome's biblical prefaces, and indeed to Jerome himself in Amiatinus, also indicates that they had perhaps accepted his arguments for the scriptural authority of the Hebrew tradition rather than the Septuagint. Bede's exegetical works further support this view, as he frequently compared divergences between the Septuagint and Hebrew scriptures and accepted the Hebrew truth, Hebraca veritas, following Jerome. When Bede found his orthodoxy under attack because of the world chronology he used in De Temporibus, he defended his position in the letter to Plegwin by appealing to the authority of Scripture and various church fathers, including Jerome, Eusebius, and Augustine, and he referred to the Hebrew truth, a defense he repeated in De Temporum Ratione many years later. He didn't use the Hebrew truth, Hebraca veritas, designation in De Temporibus itself, instead simply noting that his chronology was according to the Hebrews, in contrast to that of the 70, the Septuagint. However, the source of his chronology is very clear. In attempting to explain Bede's choice of chronology, we should be aware that the authority of Scripture may have been uppermost in his mind, and especially Jerome's arguments for the preeminence of the Hebrew over the Greek tradition. Bede's concern with accuracy is also apparent in his willingness to use other sources, such as Josephus, to fill in the gaps in the scriptural record. For example, Scripture doesn't provide the regnal years for Kings Samuel and Saul in the Old Testament. The chronicles of Eusebius, Jerome, Prosper, and Isidore all ascribe 40 years to their combined reigns, whereas Bede's figure is 32, which he had taken from Josephus. The evidence, to my mind, indicates that the integrity of Scripture, not apocalypticism, was of greatest concern to Bede. This can perhaps be demonstrated in an examination of Bede's use of Anno Mundi chronology in De Temporibus. As noted already, Bede only dated one event, the Nativity, using Anno Mundi chronology in the whole chronicle. And in that case, he provided the number of years according to both traditions. Octavian reigned for 56 years. Our Lord was born in the 42nd year of his reign, when 3,952 or according to others, 5,199 years had passed since Adam. Had forestalling Anno Mundi 6000 been Bede's explicit concern, it is surprising that he would remind the reader of the other tradition at this point. In contrast, in De Temporum Ratione, where he is overtly anti-apocalyptic, he made no concession to Septuagint chronology in his announcement of the Incarnation. It's not mentioned at all. Bede's presentation in De Temporibus is reminiscent of someone comparing alternative traditions, as he frequently did in his exegesis, and opting for the more authoritative one, the Hebrew truth, without needing to ignore or denigrate the Greek translation. Bede's sparing use of Anno Mundi years also suggested he opted for the Vulgate chronology due to theological rather than chronographical concerns. This hypothesis can perhaps be further supported by the mathematical inaccuracies in Bede's chronology of the Sixth Age in De Temporibus. He noted that 703 years of the Sixth Age had elapsed at his time of writing. A date that's accurate, that's the date we know he wrote the work. And we can confirm that using the Dionysian argumenta that provide his present year as annus praesens, earlier in De Temporibus in chapter 14. However, if one calculates the number of years according to the information provided in the chronicle, if you add up the regnal years, as I've done, the total is 715. So he's gained 12 years somehow. This discrepancy is explained by the regnal years Bede used, which are whole year numbers, and seem to have been rounded up. And there are also some errors in his imperial chronology. These errors don't occur in De Temporum Ratione, in which the Anno Mundi years are the major chronological system, and also because the reigns in the Sixth Age in that work are given according to years and months, so they're more accurate. And we also know that Bede had received additional sources after writing De Temporibus, which appear to have provided him with more precise chronological information. A further argument for Bede's rejection of the Septuagint Anno Mundi may be found in texts associated with the Easter controversy, which we heard about at length yesterday. Computus and chronology were closely aligned in this period for the simple reason that Easter tables require an accurate count of the years. Prospective chronologies are especially useful because an Easter table should, in theory, be able to count forward indefinitely into the future. Regnal years are of limited utility unless one elects to count forward indefinitely from a specific reign, as was the case with years from Diocletian, which were used in Alexandrian Easter tables. One of the Easter reckonings that dominated in the early Middle Ages was that of Victorius of Aquitaine, created in the 5th century. And Victorius used 3 chronologies in his Computus, all of which were probably indebted to Prosper of Aquitaine's, his compatriot's, World Chronicle. In the prologue, Victorius linked his Easter table with Anno Mundi reckoning, specifically the Anno Mundi chronology based on the Septuagint, which placed the Passion 5,228 years after creation. He also used Roman consular years, and he counted time from the Passion, the Annus Passionis, which Prosper of Aquitaine appears to have instituted in his chronicle as he began a new year count with the Passion at that date, and the consular list in his chronicle began at that point. And Victorius' Easter table begins with the Passion. That's the first year. Bede, however, despised the Easter table of Victorius and consistently avoided the Septuagint Anno Mundi chronology used by him. So I believe, as I've argued, that Bede's primary reason for adopting Vulgate chronology was theological, but I'm sure the association of Septuagint chronology with Victorius was a concern for him. Bede's preferred Easter reckoning was that of Dionysius Exiguus, and both of his works on time advocate the Dionysian Easter tables. Unlike Victorius, who created his own Easter table, Dionysius' Easter reckoning was a translation into Latin of Alexandrian tables. However, Dionysius replaced their year count from Diocletian with incarnation dating, our Anno Domini, which he paired with indiction years. And you can see that in this Easter table. The first column is Anno Domini and the second is the indiction. The Dionysian Easter table, therefore, is key to Bede's other chronological innovation, his use of AD chronology in his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, completed about 6 years after De Temporum Ratione in 731. Easter tables rely on linear chronologies that can count forward indefinitely into the future. But in using AD dating in the Historia, I believe that Bede turned what was a useful prospective chronology into historical chronology. Dionysius Exiguus, he may not have invented Anno Domini chronology. Alden Mosshammer has, I think, convincingly argued that the manner in which Dionysius first introduced Anno Domini suggests that he was using an accepted date, not a newly invented one. So if you don't like Anno Domini dating, it's probably not Dionysius' fault, even though in the lead up to the millennium in 2000, he got a lot of blame in the media for getting the date wrong. I don't think it was his fault. But what Dionysius did do was transform the chronology's potential by using it in his Easter table. The evidence suggests that he chose to count time from the incarnation because of the ongoing Christological controversies concerning the nature and person of Christ. The mystery of the incarnation and what it meant for God to become man became increasingly important in arguments about the person of Christ in the church's first centuries. Dionysius noted that he did not wish to preserve the memory of the impious persecutor, that is Diocletian, and instead was going to count time from the beginning of Christians' hope, which is the incarnation. The significance of counting from the incarnation of the Lord was crucial for Bede, and I'll return to that at the end. However, Bede was not unique in using incarnation dating at this time. From the late 7th century onwards, Anno Domini dates begin to appear primarily in early medieval Britain and in the Frankish world, both regions where the Dionysian Easter table was in use. The oldest known example from Northumbria is in a poem by Lutting, preserved also in a St. Gall manuscript, written in praise of his teacher, another Bede, not the same Bede. And the poet writes that this Bede died when the 10 times 60th and 9 times 9th year had passed since the advent of Christ, born of the Virgin, and the 9th indiction was in effect, so in AD 681. That the poet used both Anno Domini and the indiction strongly suggests that he was a follower of the Dionysian Easter. AD is also used in several charters, land charters from early medieval Britain. The oldest surviving authentic charter is the so-called Izmir Diploma from the Kingdom of Mercia, dated to 736. And the dating clause is here, but halfway down. And it reads, the 736th year from the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ and 4th indiction. So again, we have AD and indiction. Several other charters with AD dates predate Izmir, but they're preserved in later copies, so there are doubts about their authenticity. However, 2 of these from the Kingdom of the Whitchy in southwest Britain have been convincingly presented as authentic. The Foundation Charter for Bath from 676 and a grant for Ripple from 680. And both charters actually refer to Dionysius by name, indicating that they knew his table, and they're using his 2 chronologies, AD and indiction. Several other charters from this period can also be argued to preserve authentic dating clauses. What is most striking is the variety of ways in which the Anno Domini dating clauses are presented. They almost always use the word incarnation, but vary between calling it the incarnation of Christ, of Lord, of Jesus Christ, or, as in Izmir, they use everything, Domini Nostri Jesu Christi. There is considerable evidence for Anno Domini dating in Francia, also at a relatively early stage. The role of the English pilgrim Willibrord, who followed the Dionysian Easter, may be key in this regard. Willibrord left a short autobiographical note in the margins of the month of November in his calendar. And it records that Willibrord went to Francia in the year 690 from the incarnation of Christ. He was ordained a bishop in the year 695 from the incarnation of the Lord, and he was writing in the year 728 from the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Willibrord's manuscript also contains a 19-year Dionysian table, which is the table I showed you a couple of slides ago, which confirms the source of his chronological choice. In the first half of the 8th century, we begin to see AD dates also appearing in Frankish annals, for example, the Lorsch Annals and the Annales Regni Francorum, and in Frankish computistical texts. So the weight of evidence reveals that Anno Domini years were becoming increasingly popular in the first half of the 8th century in both Britain and Francia, and independently of Bede. However, in the available examples, all but Willibrord used AD for contemporary events, and Willibrord used it for recording events in his own lifetime. Bede's distinctive contribution was to apply incarnation dating to history, essentially transforming it into a historical chronology, which is why his intervention was ultimately so significant. Bede used AD dates twice before he wrote the Historia, and the development in his practice can be seen when we compare his earlier works with the Historia. He used Anno Domini in the Historia Abbatum, his history of the abbots of Wearmouth and Jarrow, his own monastery, written soon after 716, and he used it in De Temporum Ratione, completed in 725, but very, very sparingly. In the Historia Abbatum, Bede used AD twice for contemporary and recent events: the foundation of Wearmouth in 674, for which there might have been a charter, and the death of Ceolfrith, his abbot, in 716. In De Temporum Ratione, he similarly used AD for recent events, so the conversion of Iona to the Dionysian Easter in 716, and he used older existing AD dates. So he dated the beginning of Dionysius' Easter table in 532, which was taken directly from the Easter table. Bede's practice significantly developed in the Historia Ecclesiastica because he created AD dates for events long in the past. And in so doing, he was the first to recognize the potential of AD as a historical chronology. To appreciate the complexity of the challenge facing Bede, I want to briefly show you the evidence for, consider the evidence for his chronology. This is the dating clause from the Council of Hatfield, preserved in Book 4 of Bede's Historia. And it reads, "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, our Saviour, and in the reign of the most religious lords, namely Egfrith, king of the Northumbrians, in the 10th year of his reign, 17th of September and the 8th indiction, in the 6th year of the reign of Ethelred, king of the Mercians, in the 17th year of the reign of Ealdwulf, king of the East Angles, and in the 7th year of the reign of Lothar, king of Kent, Theodore, by the grace of God, Archbishop of the island of Britain and of the city of Canterbury, presiding." This clause contains 5 independent regnal chronological systems, none of which indicates to the modern reader when Hatfield might have taken place. It has been dated to September AD 679. Bede had to reconcile a whole range of sources in creating his AD chronology for the island of Britain. In using indiction dating, Hatfield would have been one of the easier dates to correlate with AD because of the Dionysian tables where indiction and AD are in parallel columns. The challenge facing Bede grew more demanding the further back in time he went. However, his mental acuity in spotting the potential of AD to harmonize a whole host of conflicting chronological systems was extraordinarily innovative, and I think is underappreciated because using AD as a historical chronology is both obvious and natural for us. But it was neither obvious nor natural to Bede's contemporaries. Adherents of the Dionysian Easter tables who used AD years for contemporaneous purposes were practical innovators. But creating a retrospective chronology based on AD years was far more revolutionary. There's nothing in the earlier or contemporary sources to compare with Bede's creation of a retrospective Anno Domini timeline for the history of the island of Britain from Julius Caesar's invasion in the 1st century BC to his own day. Scholars of the ancient world are more familiar with the difficulties inherent in synchronizing chronologies with later eras. And Dennis Feeney, in his great book, Caesar's Calendar, has observed, the ease and apparent naturalness of our dating system conspire to beguile us into overlooking the fact that all of the dates it generates are themselves ultimately synchronisms. This is equally true for early British history, as Bede's choice of chronology has similarly beguiled us. Analyses of the historian's chronology tend to dissolve into circular arguments or resort to adding merely minor clarifications to Bede's chronology, for example, correcting his date for the sack of Rome from 409 to 410. But it's worth remembering that dating the sack of Rome to AD 410 is itself an act of anachronistic synchronism. People at the time didn't know it was 410. In creating a new chronological framework, Bede also differed from the standard practice in the early Middle Ages of replicating the chronological data in his sources. We can see Bede's process of chronological synchronism develop when we compare AD years in the HE with the equivalent AM years in his chronicles. I've done this by comparing, it's slightly convoluted, but I've worked out Bede's AD years for the Roman emperors in the Historia Ecclesiastica and compared them with calculated AD years from Anno Mundi dates in his chronicles. I'm not sure that table is actually helpful, to be honest. It takes a bit of looking at. But if you can follow it, in the first column you have the AM dates from Data Temporibus, which I've calculated because Bede doesn't give them. He gives regnal years, I added them up. The second column is the AD date that I've calculated from the Anno Mundi. The third column is the AM dates in the Data Temporatione Chronicle. The next column is my calculated AD dates from that. And then the fifth column is Bede's AD dates. And the final one is the actual AD date we use today. It might not make sense in a talk, I think. But anyway, this is an appendix to my book. But what I want to make is that there's a variation between his sources, and it becomes striking that the nearer Bede gets to his own time, the more accurate his AD dates in the Historia become. Whereas the opposite occurs when converting his Anno Mundi years to Anno Domini. And this is because I think when calculating AD years in the Historia, Bede used Dionysian tables which had AD and the indiction cycle in parallel columns. So as many of his sources actually had indiction dates, like the papal letters or Hatfield's council book, these would have been relatively easy calculations, especially for events after the start date of Dionysius' table in 532. The biggest discrepancies between Bede's AD dates and modern calculations occur in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And that's because he was working backwards quite a long way. It's far more difficult to synchronize imperial years with a linear chronology, whether you're using Anno Mundi or Anno Domini. Alden Mosshammer has demonstrated this difficulty by arguing that the 15th year of Tiberius could in fact equate with any 12-month period from October 27 to December 29. So there's this tricky thing of when does the imperial year start and all this. It's not straightforward. And we can see that as Bede's imperial chronology moves forward in time, that minor errors accumulate and the discrepancies between his dates and the actual dates grow. Bede went to great lengths, I think, and great effort to create this new coherent timeline of the history of the island of Britain. While Bede's literate contemporaries would have been familiar with linear chronologies, both Anno Mundi and Anno Domini, the truly innovative nature of using AD as a historical chronology may be apparent in the initial reaction to it, which is unenthusiastic at best. The earliest extant manuscript of Bede's Historia is now generally believed to be the so-called Moore Bede in Cambridge University Library. It was written at Wearmouth Jarrow within a few years of Bede's death, and possibly as early as 737. So Bede died in 735. 737 is very, very near. Two additions to this text immediately after the conclusion of Bede's Historia and written by the main text scribe are of interest. The first is on the same folio that the book finishes, and it includes very short annals for the years 731, 732, 733 and 734, known as the Moore Annals. You can see them at the bottom of the slide. These are clearly AD years, and the entries follow the format of Bede's chronological recapitulation in HE 524, the final chapter of the book. And despite their laconic nature, they actually offer important information about political instability in Northumbria around the time Bede was writing. Information that Bede is far too diplomatic to tell us. And this includes the deposition, tonsering, and then restoration of King Ceolwulf, who was the dedicatee of Bede's history. The other edition, known as the Moore Memorandum, begins on line 5 of the next page and includes a Northumbrian king list from King Ida in the 6th century to King Ceolwulf, Bede's king at Bede's time of writing, followed by a very brief record of 9 historical events. The memorandum opens with in the year 547 and the reign of King Ida of the Northumbrians, whose reign lasted 12 years. It's followed by 16 kings in order and gives the regnal years for each. We know that Bede worked from similar regnal lists when compiling the Historia, as he briefly referred to such texts. The second part of the Moore Memorandum begins after the notice for Ceolwulf's reign with a reference to Paulinus, who baptized 111 years ago. Presumably this is a reference to his mass baptisms of the Northumbrians in our year AD 626. The following 8 events are also all dated from the author's present day. So he's counting backwards. This event happened 50 years ago. This event happened 12 years ago. And it means that the list has all been dated to 737. But what's striking, I think, is that the scribe, who has just finished writing out the entirety of Bede's Historia using Anno Domini dating, goes for an entirely different way of measuring time here. Indeed, it's almost the opposite of Bede's Anno Domini years, because Anno Domini counts forward from a significant event in the past. This method counts backwards from the present. Its limitations as a historical chronology are obvious. As Peter Hunter Blair pointed out many years ago, any document using this system is only valid for the year in which it's written. And a similar practice is evident in another early manuscript of Bede's Historia, the so-called St. Petersburg Bede. In the margins of Book 524, in that manuscript, and that's Bede's recapitulation of the main events in his texts, and in this manuscript, small Roman numerals are written in the same hand as the text alongside Bede's 80 years. And again, these numbers similarly seem to be counting backwards from the author's present day. So again, it's suggesting they almost don't quite understand what Anno Domini is. And I think it suggests that Bede's contemporaries maybe struggled a little with Anno Domini as a historical chronology. And I think that these two early responses seem to underline how unusual Bede's endeavour was. Indeed, Bede himself wrote a letter to his Bishop Egbert in 734, which he dated by the indiction, not AD, suggesting that even Bede only used Annus Domini for specific purposes. So that AD dating became a dominant global chronology is undeniable, and that Bede applied it in his Historia at the same time that many of his contemporaries in Britain and Francia also turned towards AD is also clear. But Bede's contribution was unique, and I want to conclude with why I think he actually did this. Because in applying a chronology that counted from the Incarnation, when relating the history of his own people, Bede deliberately and consciously underlined the Christian and universal character of his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. This is neither local nor national history. For in Bede's view, the conversion of his people at the ends of the earth fulfilled the biblical work of providence as foretold in the Old Testament and confirmed in Christ's last words to the disciples at the end of Matthew's Gospel, "Going therefore, teach ye all nations." For Bede, the incarnation was the fundamental moment in human salvation, and the process of salvation would be completed when all peoples became members of the universal church. Bede's every Anno Domini date, therefore, connected events on the island of Britain with the great Christian story of salvation. This chronology was mediated to him through the Dionysian Easter tables, but his extensive corpus, and especially his exegetical works, reveals the levels of meaning that the incarnation had for him. Bede counted time from the incarnation of the Lord, ab incarnatione Domini, in the Historia, because he wanted to remind his readers that the promise of salvation, revealed at the incarnation, was fulfilled in the conversion of his own people at the ends of the earth. His chosen chronological apparatus therefore becomes a concise and meaningful creedal statement. Thank you very much.
We all are grateful to Professor Maureen MacCarRON for this lesson that was at the same time so thorough, so complete, and also so clear. So very an example of discussion a so complex author that at least is Bede, one of most important our sources for the Middle Ages. So, thank you very much. Do subito la parola.
Now I leave the floor, going back to Italian, I leave the floor to Giorgio Strano, who's very well known in his works of history of science, and more specifically, I think that is quite expert also on Galileo.
Risetto questi 45
Così lo
minuti.
vedo anche.
Così. Prego.
La ringrazio.
Thanks to the organizers for this invitation and is allowing me to introduce a topic that I've discovered, I would say myself, for the first time. It is not that common while I was preparing my report, which are the instruments to measure time. So in the following, I will introduce a rather broad picture with many gaps, I would say more gaps than details. Subject of this picture that I will depict will be the tools for knowing time in a broad sense made in the early medieval European area that may be made available in this area through contacts or overlappings with other cultures. Wherever it's possible, whether it is a case history, I will venture some assessments. I will not, on the other hand, discuss hourly systems, except for some sketchy news if necessary. I will start with some general observations. Establishing with which instruments time was measured in the European area between the 5th and 10th century is not absolutely trivial. However, also the identification of a few chronometers, let's say in a broader meaning of this word, can offer information about the perception of time by communities or individuals. More specifically, material instruments provide insights into how keenly felt was the quest for precision in determining the time of the day and night and their multiples or fractions. The need for precision led to the construction of accurate measuring instruments, and conversely, accurate instruments indicate the quest for precision. Precision, however, to quotation marks, is by itself a cultural entity, so its meaning varies according to the reasons for which physical quantities are being measured. Among the factors that play the role in obfuscating what is now offered to historians of science and technology on the subject of early medieval chronometers, the primary role belongs to the way in which political and religious powers perceived science. Quite roughly, in the European area, even before the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the theories of Alexandrinian astronomers, which were wedded to the accurate measurement of time, were perceived by some fathers of the Church as an emanation of pagan thoughts and judged execrable. In the Middle Eastern area, instead, the same theories were held in esteem, both from the chronological and astrological perspective, chronological for prayers. The project of the Alexandrian mathematician Claudius Ptolemy, aimed at precisely determining the present and future positions of stars and planets, with the dual purpose of establishing an exact chronology and drawing reliable astrological auspices, this project made use of the most accurate measuring instruments. As a result of the aforementioned dual evaluation of Greek science, astronomical devices took a backseat in the European area, while they were still built and perfected in the Middle Eastern area. The first astronomical observatory as an institution actually arose in Baghdad under the Abbasid Al-Amun Caliph in the late 8th century. Between the European and Middle Eastern areas, for their geographical location, it's important to underline the situation of the Byzantine Empire, in which also for linguistic reasons, Greek science was not set aside. In addition to the political and religious difficulties that shaped the production of scientific instruments, there are other difficulties related to the material survival of the objects built. First, unlike the great instruments for measuring stars' positions, we note the tendency of the authors from antiquity to the 16th century not to describe exclusively chronometric devices. Such objects are mentioned only in a superficial way. The widespread reticence suggests free readings, of which one does not necessarily exclude the other. On the other hand, chronometric instruments could be given to be commonly known, given their everyday utility, so as not to require words in addition to the evocation of their names. On the other hand, some instruments that had fallen into disuse could be mentioned by an author only for completeness of exposition. On yet another side, the lack of precision that mathematicians attributed to these objects may have caused their omission from the great astronomical compendia. In fact, by analyzing observational procedures from the Alexandrian period until the 16th century, the use of practices designed to minimize the incidence of chronometric errors became evident. So regardless of the kind of chronometers, they were not working perfectly. Secondly, scientific instruments became obsolete. This is particularly true for those that are strictly dependent on celestial parameters, such as many time-measuring devices designed before the mechanical clock. Unless placed in a solid or protected location, such as an architectural element of a building, once it failed to function properly, the instrument was trivially thrown away. In such a case, the best that can happen to historians of science and technology is for an archaeologist to find back these instruments which were forgotten or thrown into the foundations of a building site, placed in burials, trapped in wrecks of ancient shipwrecks, and so on. Third, a scientific instrument is sometimes made up of several different materials and several interconnected components. Some materials, such as wood, bone, or leather, deteriorate quickly. If replacement of the worn parts was impossible or unaffordable, either because it was too labor-intensive or costly, or because there was a lack of those who had suitable knowledge to carry out the repairs, the object was once again thrown away. If, on the other hand, the object included complicated parts or made of precious materials, it could be cannibalized. This commonly used for scientific instruments, this verb, that is used as a source of spare parts or remelted and transformed into something else. Fourth, aside from the obsolescence and natural decay, in every historical area there has always been a particular form of pressure against the survival of scientific instruments, and not only those. The life cycle of an object depends on the urgent supply needs of its component materials, especially the metal ones. At a given moment in history, copper, brass, and bronze may become indispensable for building something that is considered far more important and resolutive than a scientific object. These are usually weapons and ammunitions. A final point unfavorable to historians of science and technology is less radical than the previous one. Archaeological excavations take place under the supervision of archaeologists and art historians. These professionals have a privileged interest in art objects. Anything related to the so-called minor arts, science and technology, although in the recent years this has been much reevaluated, it runs the risk of taking a backseat to objects of great artistic value. Thus, once you enter the museum collections, the scientific and technological artifacts often end up in the storage, and they are invisible and neglected for decades before being accidentally rediscovered and brought to the attention of historians. So let us start with an overview of the few types of chromatic instruments that somehow are identifiable. And let us start with the solar clocks. These general introductory notes suggest looking for traces of early medieval chromatic instruments, either in buildings where they may be extremely weathered, however, or in the archaeological museum deposits. In either cases, one must prepare oneself both to the idea of encountering just a few objects, that is not enough to define the detailed picture, or short in number, and the possibility that the objects that have been discovered have little to do with a scientific tradition of a high mathematical level, such as the Alexandrian one. The most common type of early medieval chromatic instrument is the sundial. There are certain records of the instrument for the 5th century before Christ in the Greek area, Herodotus in the histories, and much earlier in the Egyptian war, developing various shapes and sizes from the portable to the monumental object. The sundial spanned all historical eras to the present day under the wrong name of sundial or meridiana in Italian. This is based on projecting the shadow of a stylus or a gnomon, from the Greek gnomon as indicator, over a tracing of hour lines. The position and the length of the stylus shadow change continuously throughout the day and throughout the year. An accurate sundial requires mastering astronomical knowledge, both to be built on the basis of the latitude of the location and to be placed correctly with respect to the cardinal points. This is all the more true for a monumental sundial, which is usually designed expressively on the basis of the characteristics of the place where it is supposed to be positioned. In the absence of minimal astronomical knowledge, however, it is always possible to trace the dial of the instrument by points, following day after day and hour after hour the path of the shadow cast by the gnomon. However, it is not. This requires the use of another reference chronometer. The geometric construction for making any sundial is set forth by Marcus Vitruvius Pollonius in De Architectura and by the aforementioned Ptolemy in the Analemma. The day is divided into the Roman-derived and Egyptian-derived 24 hours and remains so in early medieval period. Isidore of Seville clarifies that the actual day from sunrise to sunrise consists of 24 hours divided into two spaces. The diurnal space from dawn to sunset contains 12 hours. Nocturnal space from sunset to sunrise contains other 12 hours. From this definition, it follows that the duration of the day-night hours varies with the seasons. This is the system of unequal temporal or seasonal hours to distinguish it from the system of 24 equal or equinoctial hours. The unequal hours coincide with the equal hours only in two particular cases, the 2 days of spring and autumn equinox. Most of the surviving early medieval sundials are of monumental type and tend to be embedded in church walls. They are found in a fairly wide area: Spain, France, Britain, Germany, and Italy. difficult to be dated. They're almost all rather late, like the earliest one set on the facade of St. Andrew's Church in Bishopstone in Sussex, datable between the 8th and the 9th century. And then the criterion of dividing the diurnal space into 12 hours, sometimes joined to form groups of 3. So from the 1st to the 3rd, to the 6th to the 9th, and from the 9th to the 12th. And this corresponds to 4 intervals between the 5 practices. The instrument from which these objects are descending is probably the sundial scaphedal from Scaphe Cup, and Herodotus mentions this in the Stories of a Babylonian derivation. It's a hollow hemisphere where the hour lines are reversed from the ideal geometric lines of the sky sphere. And as you can see in the slide, the end of this stylus, which is a little ball, is placed exactly at the center of the construction sphere, and in essence, its shadow indicates where the sun is on the celestial sphere. The difficulty of making a hollow hemisphere had soon inspired some simplifications. The extent of the spherical surface had been reduced to the essentials, that is, to the part occupied by the hour lines between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, or little more. In some cases, then, the spherical surface had been further simplified by replacing it with a conical surface. So both of these kinds, spherical and conical, are to be found in sundials found in the Alexandrian area, carryover in the Roman Empire, carryover because the Romans often appropriated instruments found in the Alexandrian territory or copied them, placing them in the gardens of their mansions. That is, the Romans did not mind the not insignificant fact that the difference in latitude between a place of original making, like Alexandria in Egypt, and the place of later placement, for example in Pompeii, severely impacted on the accuracy of the instruments. The process of simplification seems to have continued until it resulted in the early medieval sundials. The hemispherical cavity of the scape takes the shape of a stylized hemisphere, a vaguely concave, if not flat disc, placed vertically rather than horizontally. The hour lines are radial and occupy the lower half of the disc. They are usually, but not always, drawn at equal angular intervals from each other. The result of the construction is that the hours indicated by the shadow of the stylus that is placed horizontally from this point projected to you as observers. Hours are unequal not only for the season change, but also with each other. The hours after dawn or before sunset, when the sun rises or falls obliquely to the horizon, last longer than those when, near noon, the sun appears to move parallel to the horizon. This outcome does not change even if one mounts the stylus parallel to the Earth's axis, as it was done and is still done today in many sundials. The inherent inequality of the daylight hours of any given day of the year is significant and goes beyond the failure to apply refined geometric constructions. Early medieval time, controlled by the Church, does not flow evenly throughout the day at a pace dictated by the sun, but in a fluid manner. Solar time and ecclesiastical time coincide only at dawn, noon, and sunset. Otherwise, the equality of the hours of the day is a matter of authority, so to say. As for the finer fractions of the hour, only in a few cases the need is felt to mark the half hour.
And we must not overlook the possibility of assigning these objects a symbolic role. They work best only when facing south, but even in this case, their use is limited. They cover all 12 hours of the diurnal space when the sun is between the autumnal and spring equinoxes, that is in autumn and winter, when the weather tends to be cloudy. contrast, they function for a reduced number of hours when the sun is between the spring and autumn equinoxes, that is, in spring and summer, when the weather tends to be clear. It will be a bit complicated to explain you the reason for this difference between winter and summer. Anyway, if you need more information, we can discuss later. So one gets the impression that rather than from measuring time, these sundials emphasize ecclesiastical control over time and its measurement. The limited operation of vertical sundials could have been overcome by similar horizontal instruments. However, the early medieval version of these other instruments, found in an early 8th century manuscript by St. Willibrord, is more of a diagram for finding the approximate time by looking at the position of the sun relative to the cardinal points. Now, let's see those which could be the portable clocks, sundials. It is not possible to determine which portable clocks were in use in early medieval period. The materials marked the rapid degradation and disappearance of most of these objects due to those negative factors that I mentioned at the beginning. Vitruvius mentions the sampling of portable sundials as well as the names of some of their inventors. The lack of findings pertaining to older types forces us to doubt that they were still in use 5 centuries after the writing of De Architectura. It is not easy to determine which types of tools in use in the late Middle Ages were also widespread earlier. For example, the so-called quadrans vetus, which is a quarter cycle with hour lines and movable cursor, this part, necessary to adapt the reading of the instruments to the day in which one is definitely present at the height of the 14th century. Evidence has been gathered on the conception of this time meter in the Arab world, most likely in Baghdad, at the height of the 9th century. So, concluding that the quadrant vetus penetrated European countries even before the year 1000, well, maybe it's too long. We can say that 2 types of portable sundials existed in the early medieval period. The first one is the reduced version in pendant form of the monumental sundials in churches. An example is the English instrument made of sandstone preserved at the History of Science Museum in Oxford. Unfortunately, this finding is ascribable to a generic medieval age. However, it is plausible that what was observed on church facades had immediate parallels in a small-scale version. It should be noted that unlike the monumental object, oriented once and for all, in a facade of a church, the owner of the portable version must have had a good grasp of the position relative to one's geographic south horizon, so as to direct the dial of the instrument toward it. Therefore, this is not a travel instrument, but an object to be used in a place with a known geographical location, one's home or church. The second type of portable sundials, portable sundials, 9 specimens have been preserved. These are instruments of Roman origin, the earliest of which, preserved at the History of Science Museum in Oxford, was found in the area of Bratislava and dates back to 250 AD. Here you can see. Another specimen datable between the 5th and 6th century is located in the Science Museum in London. So you see the back, which is very complicated. So the second finding, however, is Byzantine in origin with inscriptions in Greek and adds a gear system to the basic Roman structure. Unlike the instrument built in imitation of monumental chronometers, The second type of sundial can be used while traveling. The owner must know the geographical latitude reached so as to correctly rotate the face of the instrument. We can see the image, so this is a slightly different type. So it has to be rotated, so the face of the instrument with respect to the vertical. And the owner must also know the course of the sun along the zodiac during the year in order to correctly tilt the rotating cursor. Only then they can direct the instrument toward the sun and read the time. It is therefore not an instrument for everyone. The possessor must not have renounced the Greek science. It is therefore, so we can say that the instruments in the Science Museum is of Byzantine origin, as are 5 others of the 9, the existing 9. Unfortunately, these are just hypotheses, and so now let's see that which is called nocturnal. Time is not only measured during the day. Unfortunately, however, sine sole sileo, and so the need to count the hours at night demands to turn to the stars. At the beginning of the 5th century, the use of stars as time markers is mentioned by John Cassian in the Cenobiorum Institutis. In the 6th century, Gregory of Tours wrote the Cursus Stellarum specifically to teach how to distinguish the hours from direct observation of the stars, the positions of which change throughout the night and year. The procedures referred to do not require one to be equipped with refined observational instruments. If in line with what is obtained from sundials, a nominal accuracy of half an hour is deemed sufficient. It is enough to spy the transit of certain stars in front of a small window, preferably facing south. More interesting appears to be the possible use of an instrument based on the rotation of stars around the celestial North Pole. In Alexandrian times, the celestial North Pole, which is an abstract, invisible geometric entity, was empty. So you see where it was at the time of Hipparchus of Nicaea. So at the times of Ptolemaeus, it moved a bit. In the 10th century, it started to be quite close to the Polaris. So around the 5th century, as a result of the precession of the equinoxes, a relatively bright star, the Polaris, began to appear close enough to the celestial North Pole that it could be considered visible. So we have to think of an instrument that combined the calendar disc, an hour disc, but centered on the Polaris, and an index. The index was used to measure the position of certain stellar pointers, preferably the last 2 stars of the Big Dipper, which realize a classical alignment with Polaris. The angle formed with respect to the horizontal, vertical by the segment joining the pointers to the Polaris depends on the day and the time. The rule is obscurely mentioned by the Veronese Archdeacon Pacifico in the 9th century. For this reason, Pacifico is believed by some to be the inventor of the Horologium Nocturnum, or nocturnal. The instrument known as the nocturnal appears in the early 16th century. However, both Pacifico's words and illustrations in some manuscripts suggest the existence of something with similar functions to the nocturnal even in the early medieval time. Of course, the manuscripts are a bit come late. The illustrations present monks observing through what someone believed to be spyglass. But actually it is an observation tube of Aristotelian memory that is a hollow tube with a slightly trumpet-shaped profile by which to concentrate the visual rays emitted by the eye and to make the gaze sharper. In the educational sphere, the tube was used by the teacher to accurately point out a star to the pupil. However, in the manuscripts, we notice around the end of the tube what appears to be a coarse set of radial reference lines. It is quite legitimate to conclude that the star in question, in the previous manuscript we could see it well, so is the Polaris, and that the system of radial lines constitutes a stylized dial by which to read the time indicated by the position the pointers occupy there. Unfortunately, the codices in which pointer tubes appear combined with possible time references tend to be late from the 10th to the 11th century. Now let's see another type of time meters, water and sand clocks. A problem which cannot be circumvented in astronomical time measurements is bad weather. With cloudy skies, neither the sun nor the stars can be seen. So, since late antiquity, it had been an established custom to use water clocks or hourglasses to measure the passage of time by the amount of liquid that flowed into a container. So it is out of place here to expound on all the devices developed by the Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Alexandrians, and Romans to ensure that the flow of water was uninterrupted and constant. The shape of the vessels and their number, the shape of the water outlet nozzle, and the material from which it was made. So we see there were several vessels which were used to stabilize the outgoing water, and so these represent a great examples of technological innovations. So in early Middle Age, water clocks were in current use in the Middle Eastern and Byzantine areas, often combined with ingenious automata, which transformed them into particularly ambitious artistic and technological objects. Beyond seeming excessive in monastic circles, Byzantine and Middle Eastern instruments appeared in the European area only with Pope Sylvester II, Gerbert of Aurillac, as gifts brought by Muslim ambassadors. That said, although the evidence for the presence of water clocks in monasteries is very late, in this case, second half of the 13th century, it seems plausible that at least the major monasteries were equipped with the water clocks of some sort to be tempered constantly on the movement of the sun and the stars. The water clock, or hourglass, must not be confused with the object which erroneously is called hourglass today, which consists of two opposing glass cruets into which flows sand, rather finely ground hydrophobic material. The correct name for this instrument is sandstone, from the arena sand that precisely marks the time. A very ancient origin, the presence of sandstone is attested with certainty in early medieval times, only in the 8th century, when such an instrument was made by the monk Liutprand, active in Chartres Cathedral. However, the maximum diffusion of the instrument in the European era is much later, between the 14th and 16th century. In any case, it was not a true timepiece, a time meter, but a device for marking the expiration of relatively short intervals of time, half hour at most. Another type, candle clocks. So another way of marking time in the absence of astronomical references was by burning something that was slowly consumed. no candle instrument has reached our time for clear reasons. So operation assumed an instruction of the object, otherwise housed in an ordinary lantern. In Europe, so disregarding the much older tradition of combustion clocks in the Far East, the candle clock is believed to have been invented by Alfred the Great. From the Elogium Historianus, we learn that the device attributed to the English rulers consisted of 6 candles made of 72 pennyweights. 1 pennyweight is more or less 1.55 grams of wax. Each candle, which is about 30 centimeters thick, was divided by horizontal lines into 12 1-inch sections. One candle burned for 4 hours and allowed the passage of time to be measured in intervals of up to 20 minutes each. To avoid exposure to drafts and other outside factors which would have caused their irregular consumption, the candles were placed in a container closed at the side by transparent horn foils. This is just a reproduction which was made a few years ago. Judging from the description, it seems that these candles relied on a division of time into equal hours. So the similar graduated candles were used in other European courts is only a guess. According to some, however, it seems likely that they were used in churches. Oddly enough, in the Arab world, attestations of candle clocks much more complex than the one ascribed to Alfred the Great are found no earlier than the 13th century. They are associated with complex devices, in some ways similar to water clocks accompanied by automata. The last object that I'd like to describe is the plain astrolabe. So I go back to the astronomical methods of measuring time. Indeed, it is not possible to close an overview of early medieval time measures without mentioning that which for centuries was considered the most versatile scientific instrument, the plane or astrolabe or planispheric astrolabe. Among the many functions of the instrument, there is the determination of the time of both day and night through observation of the height above the horizon of the sun or certain reference stars. The origin of the instrument is still a matter of debate, since a plane astrolabe is based on the stereographic projection worked out by Hipparchus of Nice. It is to him that some attribute its conception. Since the usual Ptolemy mentions in the planisphere a horoscopic instrument equipped with an aranea, and since each plane astrolabe possessing a revolving net or web, it is to Ptolemy that others attribute its conception. To be sure, the oldest text on the instrument dates back to 530 AD and is due to the Alexandrian philosopher John Philoponus. The first textbook on its construction and use, which however according to some hold echo a lost work by Theon of Alexandria, is due to the Syrian Severo Sebokht. From the 8th century onward, the instrument is present in both the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world. In the latter, it is elaborated and enriched with new functions, giving rise to a flourishing treatise, for example, the treatise of the Pseudo-Mashallah, possibly 8th century. Notably, among the instrument's various time systems, lines appear that indicate, to an approximation of a few minutes, the 5 moments of Muslim prayer. These ones. Despite its great presence, no plain astrolabes are preserved prior to the 13th century. Moreover, built both in the Middle East and Muslim Spain by genuine specialists, often distinguished by the name Al-Asturlabi. The instrument enters the Latin era rather late, probably through Gerbert of Aurillac. The Pope Sylvester II studied in Barcelona, a Christian city, so in contact with Islamic culture. In the 11th century, the Latin world also developed treatises on the plain astrolabe, for example, the De Mensura Astrolabi Liber of Hermann on contrast. But now we are in another Middle Age. Thank you.
Allora, ringraziamo molto, questa lezione è bella, che sempre...
I'm sorry, I cannot hear. He has to speak on the microphone. Sorry, I forgot. I was lost in the astrolabe. So I attended a conference about Gerbert of Aurillac some time ago. So we're always fascinated by the technical science. A lot has been written, but still a lot has to be written because these raises general issues and questions about civilizations, about different cultures, transmission of text or lack of transmission of text, because several times there is a problem concerning the fact that some scientific technical texts sometimes were very evolved and developed, but then they had quite a difficult journey. So these are general issues which are very, very fascinating. So thank you, Professor Strano, for your clear explanation and brilliant explanation. So really, thank you. We are very interesting in all these topics. So now we will have a break, but please come back at 10:45 for the lecture by Angélique Ferrand on the zodiac.
For lesson of Professor Angélique Ferrand from Poitiers, über le zodiac. Bene, buona pausa.
Enjoy your break and see you at 10:45 sharp.
Cette horloge figée sur les 45 minutes.
Normalement, je crois que je tiens moins de temps, à mon avis, donc ça devrait aller. Moins que.
Les collègues français, normalement, sont assez précis et ponctuels. Pas toujours, pas tous.
Non, pas toujours.
Questo è silenzioso, perfetto. Aspetta, i fatidici 45.
Je ne sais pas si ça fonctionne.
Ça va? Ci siamo. Così. Buonasera, signore e signori, ben ritrovati.
So welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are here now.
Cosa devo leggere? Preghiamo, scusami, fammi capire cosa devo leggere. Preghiamo di consegnare alla segreteria presso il modulo per la partecipazione alle giornate di vabbè. Lo leggo dopo? Sì. Alors, je suis très heureux de présenter Madame Angélique Ferrand de l'Université de Poitiers.
I'd like to introduce to you Professor Angélique Ferrand, University of Poitiers. Is going to talk about the signs of the zodiac and Christian time. So this link between the cosmos and ecclesia. Afterwards, we will have a debate on the 3 morning lectures. Okay? You have the floor. Thank you. Let me first thank Cisam for inviting me, the organizers for their welcoming support, and the interpreters for their work. And the interpreters, thank you. So the following speech is not focused on the scientific astrological aspect of the zodiac, rather on how the representation of the 12 signs of the sky has been used to stage the relationship between the Church and cosmos, particularly from a temporal point of view. From ancient times, the signs of the zodiac were used as markers both in space, that of the sky, and in time, but also to refer to the afterlife, the after death, and the sphere of the divine, and quickly became a symbolic representation of the cosmos. The mythological stories related to each of these signs are at the basis of both the mnemonic dimension of these figures, while considering an iconographic reconstruction that is very rich. The Carolingian atmosphere, favored by the development of the encyclopedic iconography inherited from antiquity, of which the zodiac is a part. Number 12, that governs the zodiac, refers to a whole series of correspondences between the signs, the months, the apostles, and so on. Cassiodorus, for example, commented on the harmony of the number, recalling that the arrangement and organization of creation are a work of the Lord. On the one hand, you can see the quotation here on the screen, which refers to Cassiodorus. So first we will examine the signs of Historia and the liturgical time through the signs of the zodiacs. Then we will observe the association of the signs of the sky with the apostles. Finally, the sign of the zodiac will be debated and analyzed according to the ordering of the Church and the liturgy. Using different examples, liturgical objects and manuscripts, will show how the signs of the sky have been object of a Christian reappropriation to support the rhythms of Christian time and to link the Ecclesia to the harmony of the cosmos. The first part refers to the signs of the Historia and the liturgical time. The zodiac benefited from the calculus, and so the need to have a correspondence between the earthly rhythms and laws which coincide with the divine order. The 12 signs of the sky were particularly appropriate to crystallize this connection. The representation of the signs of the zodiac progressively asserted itself outside of the astronomical field until it really became, during the High Middle Ages, a formula referring to the divine order, a real image and sign of the structure of the cosmos of divine origin. Let us move to inscribing Christian time in cosmic rhythms. In the Bible of Vivian, known as the first Bible of Charles the Bald, the sign of the zodiac adorned the initial day of Desideri of the preface of Saint Jerome to the Pentateuch. This manuscript on the screen dates back to around 845-851, was produced at Saint Martin de Tours. The perimeter of the initial subdivision is compartmentalized and hosts the signs of the sky. Pisces is arranged during the eclipse of the sun, like the constellation of the southern Pisces, in astronomical manuscript compositions, while the sign of Virgo is connected to Libra. This initial announces Genesis at the heart of a letter, of a text that interweaves different scales and temporalities, those of creation and of the Ecclesia, those of the Bible and its successive translations and copies. The signs of the zodiac stand out in gold against the background of the parchment, and thus make visible the rhythms of the cosmos in the constructed space of the manuscript. The scrolls that alternate with the zodiac signs link the cycle and the initial to the border. They are part of a set of signs and materials that show the continuum of creation as well as that of the biblical tradition. The zodiac is one of the many cosmic themes that appear in the Utrecht Psalter, which dates back to the first half of the 9th century. The sun and the moon are represented several times in this manuscript, notably on a folio that interests us, that we also, page 36, but we also find the seasons, the stars, and personifications of the winds. All these themes aim to highlight the universal dimension of the praises addressed to God and testify the influence of an encyclopedic culture of late antiquity on the iconography of liturgical manuscripts. Produced in a monastery in Rheims, this manuscript is the result of a process of copying and revision based on a model from the 4th or 5th century. The circle of 12 signs circumscribes the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, illustrating Psalm 64 of the Vulgate, the Decet Hymnus. Signs have been drawn between two concentric circles that form the periphery of a Clypeus, a motif of cosmic dimension of ancient origin that translates the connection between heaven and earth. The busts of the sun and the moon flank and surmount the whole. Thus traced, the zodiacal orb circumscribes the celestial city. Moreover, zodiacal signs have been compared by Veda the Venerable to 12 gems that adorn a belt enveloping the heavens in its De Temporum Ratione. That has already been mentioned yesterday. Moreover, the zodiacal circle, together with the two luminaries, synthesizes the seasonal rhythms of the year mentioned in the text. In the Clipos, Christ logo stands on a mountain and displays a cross with a shield which traces the radiating axis around which everything is ordered. The cross is inscribed between the signs of Pisces and Aries. Usually, circular compositions with the zodiac are organized in a symmetrical way, and this choice appears, therefore, as a deliberate choice. The cross, pivot of Historia, is incorporated into the cosmic rhythms. Pisces and Aries mark the end of winter and the beginning of spring. They are here represented in place of the Alpha and Omega. The cross thus contributes by its position to the Christian re-sematization of the zodiacal cycle, which it controls in all its cosmic dimension. In addition, the sign of the cross is corresponding to the zodiacal sign of Virgo arranged in the axis. The zodiacal Virgo that you can see on the screen with this detail at the bottom. I've moved its detail a little bit to make it more visible. So as I said, the zodiacal Virgo has a raised arm, as you can see in its iconography, and holds Libra by a thread. The signs thus announce the redemptive dimension of the incarnation. The signs have been oriented in the opposite direction of the cycle, so that Sagittarius pursues the sign of Scorpio with its arrows. Let us now move to the Signs of Heaven as Signs of Christ's History, the Aule Sidere, sung by John Scotus Erigena. The verses composed by John Scotus Erigena about the Aule Sidere of the Palatine Chapel of Campaign testify a Carolingian reappropriation of ancient cosmic iconography. According to this poetic commentary, which relates the cosmos to the incarnation, the decoration was to compose a celestial vision that Charles the Bald could contemplate sitting on the high throne. The signs of the zodiac were used as spatial and temporal markers in a fantasized description narrative, as well as markers of Christ's story. The poem indicates that the 12 signs girdle with their way on the celestial vault the tetragonal world. The signs of Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn are mentioned later in Echo with Christ with the following verses. It is for you, Aries, to applaud the triumph of Christ in his conception. Let Capricorn claim the joys of the Word being born, the precursor of light being born at the vertical of Cancer. And the Libra, conceive. You clearly know our 4 trophies. Michel Foussard, they quote here in this translation, pointed out that these 4 zodiacal signs correspond to the equinoxes and solstices, crucial points of the year related to the Annunciation, the Nativity of Christ, Nativity of John, and the conception of John. The zodiacal signs belong to a way of thinking that works in an analogical mode by interlocking of scales and temporalities that put in signs the Christian history. Now I move to the second part of my lecture, the signs of heaven and the apostles, cosmic time and church time. As early as the 1st century AD, Philo of Alexandria associated the 12 signs of the zodiac with the gems of the high priest's breastplate and with the patriarchs. By extension, the apostles were associated with 12 signs of the sky, notably by Clement of Alexandria, when he evokes the breastplate of the high priest. I quote, "The 12 stones arranged in rows of 4 on the chest describe the cycle of the zodiac with the 4 changes of season, We can also see the prophets who designated the writers of each alliance. Indeed, it would not be wrong to say that the apostles are both prophets and writers. This correspondence between the zodiac and the apostles in the texts was highlighted by Jean Danielu in an article published in 1959. We have already analyzed this correspondence with Rabban Maur. In Rabban Maur, the correspondence schemes based on number 12 were used in one of the Carmina Figurata of his De Laudibus Sancte Crucis, written before 810. The poem we're interested in is found on the verse of folio 13 of manuscript 223, preserved in Amiens. The 12 months, the 12 signs, the 12 winds respond to the apostles around the cross. This one stands out on the sewing of letters of the folio and is at the heart of the network formed by 12 branches inscribed in a square. The verses arranged in the branches and arms of the crosses are the following. In Latin, you can see them on the screen. In the cross, now the months, the winds, the 12 signs of the zodiac. The flock of the apostles shines with a dazing light. This trunk of the cross, this region, and the work of the world are also associated. The Holy Cross can bring this wealth through a frequented path. In the Laudibus, in the words of Michel Perrin, time itself, invisible by nature, becomes visible and shows eternity at the heart of human history, which thus becomes a holy history. Several folios visualize time, of which the incarnation is the standard of measurement. The whole Rabban Maur's poetic commentary is situated in a cosmological, theological, and eschatological perspective. As a vector of harmony, the number 12 weaves a network of analogies, notably between the apostles and the signs of the zodiac. Rabban Maur's Carmina Figurata illustrate the idea of a time-space impression in which the cross plays a pivotal role. The graphic translation of these conceptions and articulations, as well as the specialization of the image and/or the visual poetry, as in the words of Michel Perrin, puts it synthesize several temporalities. Now let us move to the following topic, that is the calendar marked with the signs of the sky, the apostolic figures, and the martyrology of Juan d'Albert. The correspondence between the signs of the zodiac and the apostles has not failed to be put into images in different ways. Reference is underlying in the martyrology of Juan d'Albert, kept in the Vatican Library. This is one of the oldest preserved examples of the zodiacal cycle associated with the occupations of the months in a medieval manuscript. The cycle is set in a series of full-page architectural decorations that vary throughout the calendar. The bases of the columns in particular change, and we find heads, notably zoomorphic, Atlantis, small ediculae or spheres. The months, still close to the ancient personifications, sketched gestures of the monthly occupations. The signs of the zodiac are integrated into the scenes, either placed in lower part or held in some cases by the month itself. The month of September, associated with the sign of Virgo, is missing because there is a gap between folios 19 and 20. The cycle begins with January, holding Capricorn by the horns, or as an attribute, while holding a pig upside down with the other hand. Aquarius is merged with the month of February and holds a long double-necked vase, which can be found in a computistic and astronomical collection from St. Gallen, in which Capricorn has the same elongated and jagged horns as in the martyrology. So we have the evidence of a connection between the astronomic documents and this kind of manuscripts, liturgical manuscripts. Each architecture is surmounted by verses from the Decinis Duodecim Mensium of Bede the Venerable, taken from the Dialogue of Ozone, in qua mense quod signum fit ad cursum solis. These verses increase the rhythmic dimension of the cycle and reinforce the association between months and sign. As Martin Julian has suggested, the cycle of the months and the zodiac has been the object of a certain Christian resemantization, which has involved assimilating the months to the apostles. January thus has the physical characteristics of Saint Peter, frequently represented in early Christian art as an elderly man with a full beard and slightly curly hair. He does not wear his keys, but occupies the place of Janus, who shares the same attribute as the guardian of the gates of the air. The month of June responds to him in the guise of St. Paul, whose elderly face with a bald forehead contrasts with his slender body, whose naked torso reveals a youthful musculature. You can see these two mounts on the screen. The two apostles echo each other between January and June, especially since they are celebrated on the 29th of June. The two pillars of the Ecclesia thus punctuate the year and situate the calendar in an ecclesiological perspective. The signs of the zodiac seem to be subject to the rhythms of the Ecclesia, as witnessed by their lower position, or the gesture of Peter, January, who holds Capricorn by its horns. Moreover, Paul, June, holds a tray with the busts of the Gemini, which may refer to the Old and New Testaments, according to a commentary by Zeno of Verona, except that they refer to the Jews and the Gentiles, between whom Paul is a mediator. The temporality of the martyrology of the sanctoral is thus put in resonance with the time of apostolic origins and the seasonal and cosmic rhythms. The resemantization of this calendar and its association with martyrology also induces the evocation of bread and wine. Georges Coumet has pointed out that the two Eucharistic species are emphasized in the calendar scenes, particularly by the harvest and the grape harvest. The month of October also seems to propose a theological reading. The lacunar figure holds bunches of grapes in his left hand, while a few grapes are placed in the trays of the balance that he holds in the other hand. The grapes evoke wine and, by extension, the blood of Christ, whose grains, drops, are scattered on the scales. The weight of sacrifice seems to be suggested. A parallel between the time and the liturgy of the history of Christ's life is thus set up around these temporal and liturgical markers. To conclude these remarks about this manuscript, we can add that the dedication scene, located opposite to the month of January, will show Lothar I, to whom the martyrology was initially dedicated, or more likely his successor, Louis II the Younger, who receives the manuscript from a cleric in the center of the folio. The temporal ruler is thus linked to the order of the martyrology and the ecclesia, while the signs of the zodiac give a cosmic and universal dimension to the whole. Now I move to the following item. Reliquaries with the signs of heaven and the apostles. The apostles are associated with the signs of heaven and are placed on two reliquaries, those of Bamberg and Quedlinburg, dated from the 9th century of a similar construction and iconography. They probably come from the vicinity of Rheims or Metz. They are made up of ivory plates sculpted in low relief and engraved. One belonged to the treasury of the Bamberg Cathedral, and a second to the treasury of Saint-Servais Church in Quedlinburg. In the case of the Quedlinburg treasure, the plates were reused at the end of the 12th century, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. In both cases, the decoration consists of a series of semicircular arcades resting alternately on pillars and columns with Corinthian capitals. Between each pilaster and column, a double curtain opens above each of the hallowed apostles who catch a movement or a hand gesture and hold a volumen. The curtains are tied around the columns and pilasters, and the signs of the zodiac are placed above each apostle in the semicircular lunettes. Vegetal, floral, and even astral ornaments are connected to these branches between each arcade by branches that rise up in the axis of the capitals. Around these branches are coiled snakes. The plaques were also enhanced with red paint and gold leaf. On the two reliquaries, the apostles resonate with the saint whose relics are enshrined. For the signs of the zodiac, the cosmic order is related to the ecclesial order, of which the apostles are the pillars, while the relics are the foundation of the sacredness of the ecclesia that owns them. Moreover, the column is assimilated to the apostles according to a sentence of St. Paul, sunt columnae quibus stat ecclesia. Each apostole has been individualized, even if it's difficult to propose an identification. Seen behind the curtains that refer to the veil of the temple and by extension to the heavenly Jerusalem, the apostles are here the guardians of the 12 doors crowned with stars. The sign of the zodiac does adorn a mediation box between heaven and earth, synthesizing the cosmos, signifying the eternity of the celestial city and glorifying the apostles and the relics thus enshrined. The cosmic and apostolic times, the time of the saint and his commemoration, are thus intertwined. The arcades as well as the capitals and columns underline the notion of order that founds the ecclesia. Let's move to the third part, the signs of heaven and the setting in order of the church and the liturgy. Putting the liturgical material in order. The sign of the zodiac have been used as ornaments in various types of liturgical manuscripts, especially in tables, as a metaphor of the established order. For example, the tables of canons of an evangelist's book, probably from the Abbey of Fleury and dating from the end of the 10th century, are presented under 4 arches, crowned by a large arch in the lunette of which stands each time one of the signs of the zodiac, framed by its name. The 12 signs of the sky thus highlight the concordance of the founding texts of the 4 evangelists, and thus give a universal dimension to the story and its playing with temporalities. The ornamentation of the architectural frame also emphasizes the order of the text and the playing temporalities by the variations around the acanthus and distribution of colors. Eric Palazzo underlined that the signs of the zodiac constituted one of the principal iconographic themes of the sacramentaries, fundamental instruments for the good progress of the liturgy. Among the manuscripts of this type, the decoration of the sacramentary of Marmontier for the use of Auton, produced around 845-850, includes the signs of the zodiac on 2 occasions, in the Adrianum and then in the Capitula of the Complements. As Cécile Boyer has clearly pointed out in her work, this manuscript puts into images the ordering of the liturgy, the church, and more broadly, Christian society. On folio 12, relating to the ordination of the bishop, the 12 signs have been distributed around the perimeter of the page within a band decorated with scrolls. The signs of Aquarius, Taurus, Cancer, and Scorpio, which occupy the median squares of each side of the border, are flanked by a semicircular medallion that houses the figures of the tetramorph. These 4 evangelists have these symbolic figures. These 4 figures with an ecclesiological dimension refer to the history of Christ and are thus related to the cosmic order. This folio follows several decorated pages depicting the role of the bishop and the ecclesial hierarchy. The signs of the zodiac refer both to the cyclicality of the liturgy and the order of the ecclesia. Their presence reflects the tension between the external ornaments and the spiritual values of the ordained bishop.
Plus loin, les
Further on, the signs of the sky adorn the capitula tables on folios 96, verso, and 97. On the back of folio 96, the signs of Aries, Taurus, Virgo, Scorpio, and Aquarius are depicted, as well as Pisces. In the middle left, you can see on the slide. So on the folio 96, we have the signs of Aries, Taurus, Virgo, Scorpio, and Aquarius with fishes almost hidden on the left. On the next folio, Gemini, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn, Sagittarius, and Leo in the middle left that you can see. The order chosen for the zodiacal cycle appears at first glance to be disordered. The cycle shown unfolds on the 2 facing folios, but it is not continuous. In fact, if we look closely, we can see that the 2 folios are both cross-referenced and circular. It seems that we have here an ecclesiological image that responds to the rest of the iconography of the sacramentary. The traditions and temporalities of the liturgy intersect, but the harmony endures thanks to the order that governs the ecclesia, which is also evident in the decoration of the borders. This original arrangement of the zodiacal cycle seems to translate that the times of the liturgy respond to and complete each other. Among the cycle, we can note the play of echoes between Aries, associated with the Annunciation, beginning the cycle at the top left, Virgo represented below, and Libra, which responds to it on the other side in mirror. These signs refer to the Incarnation and its redemptive value. The sign of Virgo is represented here as Mary with the hair spindle and loom, it seems. As for Aquarius, it is pouring an oversized vase that is reminiscent of the Eucharistic chalice as well as the baptismal water. Thus, the cosmic order, represented by the signs of the sky and the vegetal ornament, is put in correspondence with the Historia and frames the liturgical material. In 2 sacramentaries of Fulda dating from the end of the 10th century, the signs of the zodiac have been figured in the margin or even inside the text relating to the calendar. The zodiacal figure is indeed inserted in the lines, while the colors used for the zodiacal signs equal those used to sign the calendar in the opposite margin. So, the zodiac is incorporated into a set of graphic signs that make up the calendar and unify it while inserting the variation that characterize it. The signs of the zodiac are accompanied in these two sacramentaries by a small circular medallion or clipeus that surrounds a busty figure, as you can see. The formal treatment of the zodiacal signs and these figures is relatively different in the two sacramentaries, even though they share iconographic similarities. In the sacramentary preserved in Munich, the figure of the clipeus changes according to the month. For example, the June figure associated with Cancer on folio 221V carries a torch on its shoulders. The flames of this torch seem to ignite the curvature of the clipeus, and it could be a reference to the summer solstice. These busted figures are the personification of the sun, whose course through the zodiacal signs throughout the year. The irradiating head is specific to Sol Helios, and inscriptions between the clipeus and the zodiacal sign in the sacramentary preserved in Göttingen mention Sol in several times to indicate the passage of the sun in the corresponding constellation. So here you can see. So there is also reference to equinox. In this sacramentary, the calendar cycle is preceded by a frontispiece image on the front of folio 250. The image, formed by concentric circles, synthesizes the unfolding of the year through its different components: months, seasons, day, and night. Anus is enthroned in the central clipeus in the manner of Helios Sol, on his chariot evoked by 4 frontal waves. The concentric composition thus announces the calendar in a synthetic way and recalls the cosmological diagrammatic figures of encyclopedic type manuscripts. The medallion and concentric circles equal the medallions that punctuate the liturgical calendar and thus weave a network of echoes between cosmic and liturgical rhythms. So last point, liturgical combs decorated with signs of heaven, linking the order of the liturgy and cosmic order. On 2 similarly decorated ivory liturgical combs inlaid with glass and enhanced with gold, dating from the 9th century, Capricorn was depicted in association with Sagittarius. These 2 combs were made at the court of Charles the Bold and were probably made in Metz. The middle part between the 2 rows of teeth of the object take form of a bezel, evoking a small tympanum. On a face we're interested in, 2 loops rising from a palm tree of life contain a small naked archer aiming at the Capricorn facing it.
Si le signe du Sagittaire serait difficilement
If the sign of Sagittarius would be difficult to identify out of context, its association with the Capricorn allows us to follow this hypothesis. It is not insignificant to find the evocation of the signs of the zodiac on a liturgical comb. This object participates in the preparation of the celebrant before the Mass or after the consecration of the bishop, allowing him to order his hair and to make it in the image of his church. Thus, the liturgical comb participates in underlining the role of the priest and the bishop, in particular, work for the establishment of order and harmony within the ecclesia. The signs of the zodiac are represented here to evoke these notions of order and harmony in the same way that they may adorn liturgical manuscripts. They participate in underlining a mediation between earthly and heavenly, between carnal and spiritual, in which the celebrant, the bishop, is the actor. As noted earlier, Capricorn was associated with the birth of Christ in John Scotus Erigena. In addition, its hybridity may echo the dual nature of Christ as well as the mediation between carnal and spiritual in the Eucharistic ceremony. These two signs can also correspond to the end and the beginning of the year. Alpha and Omega, they surround the tree of life and adorn a comb, fully participating in the liturgy orchestrated by the priest assimilated to Christ. As Eric Palatzis pointed out, we can consider that it is Christ, the priest himself, who activates the liturgical comb at the moment of celebration so that his hair reflects the order and harmony of the church generated by the liturgy and to achieve the sacramental finality of the rite in relation to the theme of eschatology and paradise. In this way, the Christic story put into signs is articulated at the time of the liturgy on an object that is a vector of harmony. During the early Middle Ages, the signs of the zodiac were reappropriated to signify the order of the ecclesia. Poetic commentaries, manuscripts, and liturgical objects adorned with the signs of the sky put into signs in different ways the Christian history, the play of temporalities that crossed it. We were able to observe the setting and images of cosmic rhythms in relation to the times of the Historia and liturgy. In addition, we have evoked a certain number of visual clues that translate the Christian re-semantization of the signs of the zodiac and their relation to key moments of the Historia. The examples we have observed here announce the developments that will be given to this iconographic theme, in particular from the 11th century onwards, in monumental ecclesiastical decoration in terms of both spatial and temporal dynamics. As Jean-Claude Schmitt has pointed out, the presence of the zodiac recalls and magnifies the cosmic order of creation. Thank you for your attention.
Un grand merci à Angélique Ferrand pour cette...
Thank you so much, Angélique Ferrand, for this wonderful lecture that combines history of art, liturgy, and gives a new perspective, in my opinion, on the meaning of the zodiac signs. So in Italy we have a big quantity, and so they are very often associated to labor, etc. So it is a beautiful lecture. Thank you so much. And some technical information, some logistic information. So now we will have the discussion. Now we will have the discussion on the 3 lectures of today, of this morning. So I'd like to ask Professor MacCARRON and STRANO to come here. So during the discussion, I ask you to ask brief, relevant questions, of course. Roberto Relli, who is the pillar of our organization, will will give the mic to those of you who have questions. So I must read some important communications for the speakers and the counselors of the Cisam. As you see in the agenda, on Sunday the 16th, the settimana will continue in Bevagna, beautiful town near Spoleto, where we went previously. So those who want to participate in the trip to Bevagna must fill in a form in the foyer of the theater. So you have to fill in this form by tonight if you want to go to Bevagna on Sunday afternoon. So maybe you have to read this in the other languages. Well, actually, there is a translation, so maybe you can tell him.
Pas ici, mais à Bevagna, merveilleux village, merveilleuse citadine, ici près, et on prie tous ceux qui veulent participer à cette journée de compiler une carte qui est ici, dans le foyer du théâtre, et la consigner d'ici à ce soir. Merci. Forse devo farlo anche in inglese. Ladies and gentlemen, next session of our week will be at Bevagna, wonderful town here in Brescia, and it will be on Sunday, April 16. All persons who desire, qui ont l'intention de parteciper a cette journée. No, sto parlando in inglese. No, ho cambiato lingua. Chiedo scusa, sono un po' confusa. All people who participate in this journey, this day, Sunday, we beg. Must subscribe, no? Chart, modulo, a statement that is in the foyer of the theater. Fino a stasera. Ora passo al tedesco, pazienza, no?
No German, sorry. Shall I speak German? There's no need for him to translate everything. Maybe you can tell him.
April 16, Tagung wird in Bevagna, wunderbare Stadt, hier stattfinden. Alle, die wünschen an diese Tagung in Sunday teilnehmen, müssen unterschreiben ein Papier, das in der Foyer des Theaters ist, no? bis fino a stasera, bis diese Abend, va bene? Va bene. Grosso modo ce l'ho fatta. E allora adesso apriamo la...
So now we can start the discussion. Those of you who have a question or remark can raise their hands.
Sì, ha ragione Roberto Re.
Yes, Roberto Relli is right. We need to have one lecture at once. So first of all, the questions for Maureen MacCarrone and therefore and afterwards the other one.
I've got one question about innovation and tradition. So you rightly pointed out that introducing a linear timeline, so the move from, say, regnal years to linear timelines in recording history is quite a shift. It's with a high innovative character. Rooting that in the New Testament is another shift that is of significance. Prosper of Aquitaine obviously has done that already in his chronicle. I'm wondering about the potential reception of Prosper and how, if Bede's use of AD is a reaction to Prosper. So what Bede does compared to Prosper is simply changing Annus Passionis to Annus Domini. And in that sense, because you mentioned that in the Annus Mundi that Bede is using, that may be a reflex on Victorius of Aquitaine. Mm-hmm. Victorius mentions Prosper. he worked from Prosper, so I wonder whether this shift or Bede's use of AD could be a reflex of the reading of Prosper of Aquitaine, who introduced Annus Passionis as a linear timeline in history writing to the insular world, and that Bede and Prosper is used by Victorius, whom Bede disliked. So he moved from Annus Passionis to Annus Domini as a reaction to that, potentially.
Thanks, Imo. That's a really interesting question. I don't think Bede had any particular problems with Prosper, to be honest. I think, and I don't think the Annus Passionis is being used, outside of Prosper's Chronicle and Victorius's Easter table. It doesn't appear that often for it to be something that Bede would have a particular problem with Prosper's usage. But I think I could see how Victorius using Prosper's Annus Passionis, I think that's the part that Bede had issues with. But I know we've talked about this before as well, but I think as well for Bede, it is theologically about the incarnation, that for him is the fundamental moment, because for many theologians, and Bede is in this category, it's all about, the passion and resurrection, of course, they are key, but without the incarnation first, there can be no passion and resurrection. That the whole sequence of Christ's life becomes about the moment at the very beginning is what starts it off, and then you've got this kind of this cohesion between incarnation, passion, resurrection. All those three things together are crucial, and any one on their own isn't salvific. But then for Bede, it becomes about the incarnation, which is the beginning of it. So I think there's an issue with Victorius, for sure. I think Prosper maybe is a victim by association, if anything, even though he did institute it. I don't think Bede has any particular problems with Prosper, and probably did have Prosper's Chronicle, although it's interesting. I mean, he knows about Palladius, who's in Prosper, so it's very likely he did have Prosper's Chronicle. But I think the problem would be Victorius, how Victorius uses it, and then also the other side, the positive argument being the theological dimension, which by the 7th century is in a different place to the 5th century. When Prosper is writing, a lot of the Christological controversies are ongoing, and they're still being debated. It's the 7th century and the 8th century, when Bede is writing, things have moved along. And I think the incarnation is becoming much more prominent then than it would have been in the early 5th century, or the mid-5th century. Thank you.
Altre domande, interventi?
Other questions, remarks?
Naturalmente chi è nei palchi.
Of course, those of you who are upstairs can come down, even if Roberto Relli is very athletic and a sportman, he cannot climb the theater. So let's see if there are other questions. Okay, so now let's discuss the lecture by Giorgio Stano. Of course, we can go back to the previous lecture if any new questions come. I have a question in German. Can I speak German?
Vielen Dank für Ihre Beobachtungen.
Thank you so much for your observations on the measurement of time, also in terms of candle clocks. So you mentioned that in that case there are no artifacts of that time to prove this data. I wonder whether it would have been easier to use an oil lamp, that is, to fill a lamp with a specific amount of oil and then measure the time. And my question is the following: do we have any testimonies on the use of oil in the lamps for the measurement of time? Well, what I managed to find to prepare this lecture are or late oil lamps with a specific measure of time. So we're talking about 13th century onwards. That's why I didn't mention them. On the contrary, the candle clock seems to exist. So these are all things which are taken from other culture, because in Far East, for example, the use of combustion was more widespread for several centuries before Christ, especially incense. My name is Francesco Stella. I have a question for Professor Strano. I'd like to ask you a question about the nocturnals that you were describing, especially Pacifico. So you highlighted the fact that the illustrations do not date back to before the 10th century. Even if they come from the 10th century, are they the first manifestations of this instrument? They're all connected to Pacifico, yes. And in particular, Pacifico's text is quite clear. I mean, we can well understand the instrument it describes, which corresponds to the illustrated one. The codes by Pacifico are of the 9th century. The most ancient one is from Verona, conserved in Padua. So I have a question for you. Is it confirmed that this is the first testimony of the instrument? And if so, how can you explain it? Because someone supposed that Pacifico came from the East. Someone said that is the transliteration of the name Solomon. So I'd like to ask what do you think about this? Well, it's the first one who was documented. Whether it came from East, well, there are some doubts, because it should come from Far East, and so from China, where there were these type of instruments. But it's difficult to suppose that there was this cultural importation from Far East. But for sure, Pacifico is the first one in the West.
Aspettiamo un momento, mi pare che ci sia...
No.
It seems that maybe there's another. My name is Giuseppe Cornuscoli for many years now. So I have a question for Professor Strano. So something came to my mind. The texts which describe the structure of the candle instruments, do they indicate just the purpose of measurement of time, or also devotion and compassion, which the candle has kept until our day, until today? Well, I didn't think about it actually. It's a kind of professional deformation. So we look at the instrument, how it measures, what it measures. I don't think of the rest. It is also good. So the candle clock can also is used to make light. I'm sorry, I didn't make any reflections on this. I have a question for Mr. Strano. My name is Emily Cheng. I hope it's a relevant question for you. So we know that the idea of time zone is something very recent, But as we consider different areas of the Earth, so maybe there were two different times of the day. Yes, there was this awareness already in Greek time, so the time difference was highlighted, and the mean through which this was defined were the moon eclipses. So I can establish the difference in time if I observe it from different cities, and the difference of longitude in the different cities. So I don't know how much in the medieval time, to what extent this happened in medieval time. So there was the awareness, but the time zone didn't exist. Thank you. Other questions? Have a question. Silvia Camilletti. First of all, thank you for your lecture. I was very astonished by the word clessidra in Italian. I never thought about etymology which is connected to water, but you spoke about the arenario, which corresponds to our hourglass. So when did this semantic shift happen? So hourglass referred to glass. I don't know, but I think it's very recent. I keep calling it arenario, so with sand. But in this case, English works better because it's hourglass, which has nothing to do with water. But I believe it is something very recent, and I have no idea. I have no idea.
Allora,
Very well, so maybe I can add my personal remark. It's like the use of the sundial to indicate the clock, the solar clock. Well, I think that's an improper use, but relatively recent. I think there's a bit of confusion, but sometimes there is a recovery of the right etymology, which is then lost again. You lately have been debating on the armillary sphere, and I would say that the English language puts everything together, and so we tend into Italian to find the right terminology, but these are different objects for observations. So the sphere, planetarium, or the armillary itself. So we try to be clear, but sometimes it's a desperate effort. We can't make it clear at all.
allora se non ci sono
Well, if there are no further remarks, we now move to the discussion on Angelique's lecture. If I'm not mistaken, I was getting confused. No, we are right about her lecture. So we now move the floor with no further remarks to the discussion on the lecture on the zodiac and liturgy by Angelique FERRAND. Yes, good morning. I found it very interesting, and it's rather a curiosity. You referred to the iconography of the signs of the zodiac, especially in relation to the Christian world, and so the figure of Christ and the apostles, the liturgy. But I found myself studying the iconography developed in the synagogues, Syria, Palestine, and between the 5th and 6th century, and noticed that in the mosaic floors in the synagogues there are iconographic Jewish menorah or the Torah, but there were also representations of the signs of the zodiac. And given that in the text I couldn't find thorough answers, rather limited answers. So I was wondering, in relation to a different religion or culture, what could be the possible interpretation of the presence of zodiac signs in a synagogue? Thanks for this question. I'm not an expert as regards the representation of zodiac signs in synagogues, but I've been studying that to make a comparison between the Christian reappropriation of the zodiac and there's also a sort of a reappropriation of the cycle in which it was inscribed on the floors, on the pavements. In the 6th century, in the synagogues, we found mosaics with zodiac signs in the 12 months, and actually we have some points of contact between the synagogues and churches as for this floor mosaics. So there is a semitization of each sign that is connected to the Jewish religion. Well, I cannot be certain about that. I cannot answer. I'm not sorry, but I'm not an expert on this, on the Jewish tradition. But there are some works by Rachel Ashely on the zodiac, on the Jewish one, and so maybe this could be a reference for your answers in these texts. Thank you. I'm Mario Cenna. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. And I wanted to ask you, going back to the initial part of Professor Smith's works and a question by Professor Kramascoli just earlier. You have showed a wonderful slide with a circularity in the Sacramentary of Mammouthé, where there is a circle of time and a comb that is activated, as you said, by the priest when he's getting prepared for a celebration. So we have the circularity of time that you have represented very well, and the linear time. Now I'm wondering, to what extent in what you have represented in the writings, in the narratives, can we perceive a devotional nature in a zodiac sign? I mean, feeling part of an architecture, celestial, heavenly architecture, feeling oneself almost physically included into an architecture that is representing by itself almost a material condition of the divine, of God. Thank you. Thanks for this contribution, this observation. I agree with the fact that there is actually a way of relating and sort of connection. That's what I wanted to demonstrate in my lecture. And it also reaches the observations of Professor Smith in his lecture, this relation and this having a cyclical time coincide with a linear time. But there can be different nuances. It's not systematic. There are iconographic details that might help us in this connection, but there are some playing with temporality that are not deniable. Thank you. And I wanted to ask, you referred a lot to the re-sematization of the zodiac, and you showed us how this evolved in your slides. But basically, on books or the comb, and I would say that these are all supports that could be used by the elite, the wealthy elite of that time. So I'm wondering, is there a re-sematization of the zodiac signs also on objects that belong to less wealthy social groups who could not visualize the iconography in a book, but maybe through frescoes, mosaics, or is it a re-sematization that is oriented to different groups, social groups? Thank you. Well, thank you for this question. Well, actually, this re-sematization of the zodiac, well, I've been focusing myself on something visual because I'm an art historian, but actually there are some parts of the texts, Rabbano Mauro, and other texts refer not only through pictures to a wider audience. Actually, it's difficult to know what was actually understood by the whole society. And so, as for frescoes or more public works, we have some inscriptions in the monuments, and so this belongs to the 11th century. We do not have monumental representations of the zodiac before the 11th century, even though I refer to Giovanni Scotto, Rigenio, and in the chapel of Compiègne, but we don't know exactly whether there was a monumental representation, and anyway, maybe it was not accessible. But it's starting from the 11th century, and especially in the 12th and 13th century, we can find a representation of zodiac signs connected to the months, and a wider opening of this knowledge. We have the astronomic dimension targeted to the people, to a wider people. Resuming this question, I was wondering if maybe later in centuries, from the 12th century on, when astrology, judicial astrology coming from the Arabic world started to take place, and so the horoscope concerning the kingdoms, the dynasties, and whether there are examples, to your knowledge, where this connection between the liturgical calendar and the astrology was influenced also by this new astrology that started to be introduced in the Western world. So the horoscopes, not the individual horoscopes, but concerning the succession of the different reigns, what is commonly known as judicial astronomy or astrology. And I know that maybe this is not within the temporal scope that you have outlined, but I was wondering if you know of representations that would include also the new Arabic astrology coming to the West a bit later. Thank you. Thanks for your question. Well, actually, I would say later, starting from the 14th century. Maybe there was a beginning of that. I'm not an expert on this field. There are many other works dealing with this, but this came later, as far as I know. So in the 12th and 13th century, well, actually, for the representation of zodiac signs in a monumental ecclesial context, well, I cannot provide examples that come up to my mind of representations referring to the horoscope or maybe the Arabic tradition, but I think that it's a later period. Very well. So first, let me thank again Angélique Ferrand for her concentrating on the early Middle Ages. If we go to the 12th century onwards, well, we can find the zodiac representation. Angélique Ferrand has been very rigorous in staying in a very well-defined temporal space. And so we really appreciated a report that was really thorough in terms of material supports of iconography. So with this thanking and reminding you that the conference is resuming at 3:30 p.m. with a lecture by Tino Licht. I wish you all a good lunch and a pleasant day, a pleasant rest of the day. Thank you for your participation.